Welcome to The World This Week with me, Gavin Lee, here every week assessing the momentous global events that have taken place in the last 7 days with a distinguished panel of world affairs correspondents. In a week that's marked the second anniversary of the Gaza war and seen a breakthrough in peace talks, a ceasefire agreed on Thursday, which has meant the imminent release of soon. We're expecting 48 hostages still held by Hamas in exchange for almost 2,000 Palestinian prisoners. Israeli troops have pulled back to the agreed yellow line. President Trump is also expected to personally sign the deal in Egypt and then on to Israel, a deal he's widely credited for. It marks the moment the captives are expected to be freed and asks the question, are we witnessing the beginning of the end of the war?
We're at a momentous development in the last 2 years. We fought during these 2 years to achieve our war aims, and a central one of these war aims is to return the hostages, all of the hostages, the living and the dead. And we're about to achieve that goal.
It's been a week that's seen another French Prime Minister bite the political dust. Macron loyalist Sébastien Lecornu picked up the seemingly poisoned chalice only last month. On Monday, 27 days later, he resigned, became the shortest-serving PM in the history of the Fifth Republic. The man nicknamed the Pickle couldn't get France out of one. President Macron's now burnt through 5 PMs in less than 2 years. And rather than trigger elections and break the deadlock, he has rolled the dice again. We are awaiting the choice within the next hour. Supporters hope the president has a plan in place, a sixth sense, or at least a sense that the 6th PM can last longer than a lettuce.
Les partis politiques continuent d'adopter une posture comme s'ils avaient tous la majorité absolue à l'Assemblée nationale. Et au fond, je me suis retrouvé dans une situation dans laquelle j'étais prêt à des compromis, mais chaque parti politique veut que l'autre parti politique adopte l'intégralité de son programme. C'est vrai des formations parfois du socle commun, c'est vrai aussi des oppositions.
And it's been a week. The Nobel Peace Prize for 2025 was announced, awarded to the Venezuelan opposition leader in hiding, Maria Corina Machado. The panel of judges spoke of her, quote, tireless work promoting democratic rights for the people of Venezuela and of her bravery in standing against the authoritarian regime of President Nicolas Maduro. She's a founder of Somate, a non-governmental vote monitoring organisation set up to scrutinise the vote-rigging allegations that have long shadowed the country. And after going into politics and being chosen to lead the opposition movement, she was eventually disqualified, accused of a corruption plot and forced into hiding, fearing, she said, for her life and freedom.
The Norwegian Nobel Committee has decided to award the Nobel Peace Prize for 2025 to Maria Corina Machado. As the leader of the democratic forces in Venezuela, Maria Corina Machado is one of the most extraordinary examples of civilian courage in Latin America in recent times.
Joining us on tonight's panel, we have Victor Mallet, friend of the programme, senior editor for the Financial Times, author of River of Life, River of Death, The Ganges and India's Future, and The Trouble with Tigers, The Rise and Fall of Southeast Asia. Evening, Victor. Great to have you with us. The last time you were on the programme, if I remember, you were working on a new book, and I wonder if it's quite prescient, given you're working on a book about the far right. How did it start and how's it going?
Well, the book is done. Far Right France is the name of the book. It comes out in January. But the curious thing is that when I had the idea 2 or 3 years ago, the French far right was really way ahead of the rest of the pack. But now we see that in America and across Europe and in the UK, populist, nationalist, far right forces are on the rise everywhere. And France is among many countries that are undergoing this kind of change.
What a great time to bring it out. Grist to the mill with what's going on, which we will get to in a moment. We will also introduce Eric de Reguera, the Paris correspondent for Dagens Nyheter, today's news, Sweden's largest morning paper. Eric has served as special correspondent in Mexico City, Buenos Aires, Lebanon, too, during the 2006 war, and is no stranger to a conflict. So brilliant to have you with us, Eric. I want to ask you about a fellow Swede who's made the news the past week, Greta Thunberg, trying to get to a conflict zone, being arrested by Israeli forces and being deported since then. Having switched from environmentalist to world peace at the moment, how is she seen? Has she maintained her support in Sweden?
I think, this conflict obviously polarizes the public opinion, and with her very strong stance for the Palestinian cause, she has also become more of a polarizing figure in Sweden, I would say. That said, she's still very respected for her stance on climate change. And there's a lot of people that also respect her for what she tried to do when she went with these boats towards Gaza.
Is she seen as media friendly? She's clearly media savvy, but if Dagens Nyheter wanted to do an interview, for example, does she push away? Does she deal with certain kinds of media?
It's become a little bit more complicated to get interviews with Greta Thunberg because there's so many journalists that want to talk to her that she's well, it seems like she's trying to control more the media access, and sometimes there's also some degree of hostility towards mainstream media, I think, among these activists with whom she spends a lot of time now.
Very interesting. Also, 3-time Nobel Peace Prize nominee, not to be so far. Also here with us, Rina Bass is senior editor at the Washington-based independent news site Al Monitor, which focuses on the Middle East politics. Rina heads up the Israel Pulse section. Great to see you, Rina. Also, I know you're a contributor for the Jerusalem Post. I'm very interested to know for you, covering Israeli politics, just how hectic this week has been for you.
I would say that the past 2 years have been very, very hectic. So I'm not sure this week is much different than the other weeks. But personally, as an Israeli, I mean, this has been these have been very emotional days for us all, because apart from being journalists, apart from being correspondents, we're also part of whom we are. And we have seen so many of these potential agreements on the table, being discussed, being negotiated. Suddenly we have the feeling that this is really going to happen at last, that the 20 living hostages will be coming back Sunday or Monday. So it's a moment of great hope.
Your analysis and thoughts are great to hear tonight. Former Deputy Israeli Ambassador to Colombia. I want to ask about Latin America. Maria Corina Machado coming up as well, winning the Nobel Peace Prize. Thanks for being here again with us. Let's go to Jerusalem and bring in Henry Bodkin, the Telegraph correspondent based in the city. Evening to you, Henry. Thank you for being with us. You've put out this incredible article this week, deployed on a reporter's embed inside Gaza City. What was it like, and how did the reality of it compare with all of the images you'd seen?
Yeah, thank you. It was really interesting. I mean, it's a shame we can't get in independently, but that's a feature of the war for the last 2 years. So we went in with the Israel Defense Forces and into Gaza City, very close to the front line. Huge areas flattened, huge areas that are uninhabitable. The buildings will have to be demolished. Very interesting in the sense that there was a Israeli domination of the area, but not total control. They're having huge problems, or I should say they were having, until yesterday, huge problems with snipers, RPGs, IEDs. And you just had to pinch yourself that this was 2 years after the October 7 massacre, after this all started, and that Hamas was still fighting and still causing huge problems. And so the devastation of the area, the physical devastation and the loss of life were huge takeaways from that, but also just how difficult it is for the Israelis to finally defeat them. And I think that probably plays into what we're looking at now, the day after, and I think the fact that Hamas probably won't go quietly.
And this was no means an easy stroll for you, an easy embed to go round. It was dangerous, Henry. You had to move incredibly fast, just listening to your podcast on battle lines and reading your report as well. Why do you think you were suddenly allowed in, albeit briefly?
So we focused our story on the general picture of the fighting, and based on an interview with a very senior military official there who said some interesting things. But actually, the main reason the Israelis wanted us in was to have a look at the Jordanian hospital, which they say has lots of Hamas tunnels underneath it. We weren't able to get into the Jordanian hospital because they hadn't controlled the area around it or underneath it sufficiently. So they sent down a drone and we watched videos. Personally, I have no doubt that probably there is Hamas infrastructure under there. I've been in tunnels under other hospitals in Gaza. I think it's a fairly well-established fact that at times Hamas have used them. So I think they wanted to point that out. I don't know whether that had something to do with the deal, trying to make Jordan uncomfortable, because of course Jordan's one of the big backers of President Trump's deal, and at that time That was before Benjamin Netanyahu had arrived in Washington and signed up to it. So I'm not quite sure of their intentions. You never really are, but these trips are organised very quickly. You get a call at about 10:30 p.m. and they say, "Can you be down in Gaza tomorrow morning?" And you don't really have time to think. You just go.
Well, it's fantastic to have you on board. There's lots of questions that we have in the panel too, as seasoned journalists and war correspondents with us that would want to know points about Gaza City. We will return to your time there in a moment as we begin with the momentous events in the Middle East this week, which started with President Trump's 20-point peace plan that we were talking about this time last week, delivered side by side at the White House with Benjamin Netanyahu, who was publicly accepting the deal, Hamas later giving a conditional acceptance. By Sunday, the US President's Truth Social became the place to watch. He typed out his usual public diplomacy, alternating between threats and incentives, publishing a Gaza map of where Israeli forces would withdraw to and warning at the same time Hamas of obliteration unless they signed. On Monday, indirect talks began with Israel, Hamas and US teams on 3 separate floors of a luxury hotel in the Egyptian resort of Sharm el-Sheikh. Egyptian, Qatari mediators reportedly piling on the pressure, with US maintaining pressure on Israel. Turkey's intelligence chief, Qatar's prime minister, also on the ground, said to have been key in boxing in Hamas, persuading their negotiators they had little alternative. By Tuesday, the 7th, attention was on Israel, with vigils and remembrance events being held to mark the grim 2-year milestone of the Hamas massacre, with hundreds of families gathering for a memorial at the site of the Nova Festival. And on Wednesday, in Egypt, significant US negotiators arrived, Steve Witkoff and President Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner. Hours later, cameras were rolling back in Washington, marking the moment of a political breakthrough.
They're smart, but they're not smart enough. Oh, my microphone's broken. They're smart, but they're not smart enough. They have been covered by these liberal cities for so many years. And that's why we're all working with Treasury, with all these different departments, to find the criminal conspiracy.
Okay. I'm just given. I was just given a note by the Secretary of State saying that we're very close to a deal in the Middle East, and they're going to need me pretty quickly.
And at 1:30 in the morning on Thursday, the first phase of the peace deal was agreed and signed by both sides, confirmed on Truth Social. Cue videos and social media of celebrations, jubilation in parts of Gaza and in Israel too. The Israeli Security Cabinet backed the deal on Thursday night, and as of midday local time in Jerusalem, 11 o'clock here, the ceasefire is underway. Henry, we'll start with you in Jerusalem. Tell us about how it's being received there.
Well, yeah, it's quite amazing. I mean, as I think you referenced earlier, it's we've had a lot of things that have come quite far down the line before. Of course, we've had 2 ceasefires and hostage deals, but since February, it's just been this agonizing cycle of suggestions, talks, stalemate, failure, recriminations, nothing, carrying on fighting, humanitarian situation gets worse. And so, of course, this is, I think this is a day that in part many people thought would never come, but in other people thought would have to come, that the logic of the situation would have to arrive at this. It's a country that, I mean, down in Tel Aviv, even in the early hours of Thursday morning, just after Trump announced it, the atmosphere was pretty electric, and that's just grown over the last couple of days. That there's a real feeling that this will happen, and I think a feeling that once you take these matters out of the hands of this current Israeli government and the Hamas leadership, and you give it to Donald Trump, the feeling in Israel, that's when things happen, and people really believe that it will happen now. And there's, I think it's too early for relief, but sort of building joy. Monday will be an absolutely extraordinary moment if and when it happens.
And Victor, listening to Henry, you've sat here with me over the course of 2 years discussing ceasefires that came and went after a period. This time, as Henry said, feels different. And also for President Trump, was he the only one who could have got this across the line?
Yeah, I mean, I defer to Henry, who's on the spot with this, but obviously, you know, the end of violence is incredibly welcome after this extraordinary destruction, the release of prisoners, the release of hostages. Everyone's everyone's very happy about it. But a lot of the praise, I'm just wondering whether, you know, our optimism is slightly overdone, and whether the sort of the idea that Trump has done this amazing deal in negotiating a peace deal when essentially one side in the conflict has more or less been destroyed. So it was very interesting to hear Henry saying that there's still some fighting going on, but it has, you know, that we've got sort of 4/5 of the buildings in Gaza have been demolished. And the real questions are sort of still out there. What's going to happen next? You know, is Israel going to keep its promises? Which it, you know, didn't do when it attacked Hamas in Qatar during the last round of negotiations? What's going to happen to the West Bank, where there's been a lot of violence and, you know, settlers have been taking over people from Palestinians from their villages? So there's so many unanswered questions about what happens in the future that I think, you know, it's right to rejoice in what's happened, but I think we should be very cautious about, you know, the next few days, the next few weeks, and indeed the next few years until, you know, we're sure that there is some kind of lasting peace in place.
Rina, how are you reporting on this at the moment? The headlines that you're making, what's the focus on right now?
First of all, let's see that the hostages are really released on Monday. We have seen all sorts of maneuvers and developments of the last moment in the past deals, that some hostages were released and then suddenly the deal stopped for some reason or another. So first of all, let's see that the deal really goes through. I mean, in Israel, the stress is really at its peak. From the side of the families, of course, but I think almost all the Israelis. But then if you look at the larger picture, I agree in a sense we are not talking about a peace plan. Of course, President Trump used a lot this word. Maybe it was in reference to his hopes of getting the Nobel Peace Prize. But we are talking about something else, which is not a small thing. It doesn't diminish his achievement. We are talking about a plan that would see, let's hope so, the release of the hostages, ending of bombing, relief for the Gazans, entry of humanitarian aid, and the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip. That does not mean that there will be peace between Israel and the Palestinians. I think peace is very, very far away, would need a change of leadership on the Israeli side, on the Palestinian side. We are not there yet at all, even though the wording of the Palestinian statehood does appear in the last two articles of the agreement. But we are not talking about that. We are talking about an agreement that should end the war in Gaza and that should see all the hostages coming home.
It's interesting just listening to Rina, Eric, also listening to Benjamin Netanyahu today, who appeared to try to direct the narrative a different way, saying to reporters that all of the suggestions that he'd walked away from a very similar deal that, as had been reported last year, put out by Biden, that simply wasn't true. He said the only difference this time was that the pressure was on Hamas. What do you make of that?
I think it's more that the pressure was on Netanyahu. I think Israel has become more and more isolated the last few months. We've seen several countries recognizing Palestine now in September, France, the UK, and so on. And we've also seen a shift in public opinion, I think, that has caused the governments in Europe to start criticizing Israel more openly, and also taking measures like Germany restricting arms sales, something that would have been totally unimaginable just a year ago, I think. And so, I mean, there's been some developments that I think they are based on how public opinion has changed, and that has gradually isolated Israel. And when also when at the end there was pressure from the US as well, then I think Netanyahu felt that, well, I have to, save the situation somehow.
And there's a lot of emphasis put on this on September the 9th, the attempt to destroy the Hamas negotiating team by bombing them in Qatar, which is been seen as a pivotal point, to which President Trump had also, rare thing, he retweeted a New York Times article suggesting that was why he put pressure on. Henry, one thing that you've talked about, which also is worth looking at, is who comes out the other way. The fears in Israel and elsewhere of these 250 Palestinian prisoners serving life sentences for murder, for terrorism, are amongst those. I think we're still waiting who exactly is going to be free. Do you have any idea?
They're still debating it, according to lots of sources. So the Prime Minister's office said yesterday they're not going to release Marwan Barghouti, who's this quote-unquote Mandela figure who people think could be a kind of future leader of a Palestinian state. Look, so the outline agreement obliges Israel to release 250 life terrorists, Palestinian terrorists serving life sentences. I think there are only 285. So you think, well, that's most of them anyway, but that 35 difference is a lot of wiggle room, and it gives Israel the ability to kind of prevent symbolic figures being released. It seems like there's still a big ding-dong over the identities of a lot of these figures, and it's just interesting the way the talks are going this way. That there's so much optimism, so much momentum that normally something like this, would be really holding things up, and these would be the top of the headlines on the news websites, and everyone would be like, oh gosh, well, we're not going to get a deal this time. The atmosphere is almost completely the opposite. Is that even though this haggling is still going on, and it could cause some really kind of painful concessions from one side or the other, and it's not agreed yet by the sound of it, no one's thinking that it's going to hold things up seriously from the atmosphere of the discussion in Israel at the moment.
Very interesting. Rino, I interviewed recently the son of Marwan Barghouti, and a documentary filmmaker who's focused their life on him. It's called Palestine's Nelson Mandela. And it's an interesting point that he has been ruled out, imprisoned for murder. Many Palestinians support him, see as a future leader, somebody who's not associated necessarily with Hamas. I know you've been looking at the government website to see some of these figures being released. What's your take on why Barghouti isn't being released?
I think it's simple. Netanyahu needed to have the approval of his government for this deal. And if you saw what exactly they voted on, the government didn't vote on all the components of Trump's plan, because several of these components were already agreed in principle in prior votes, because there were already discussions during this past year on several potential agreements. But what the government needed legally to do was to vote on this list. Why? Because the Israeli law says that the victims of these people that are said to be released from prisons, the victims or the families of the victims have the right, they have 48 hours to petition the court against their release. This was the case in last release rounds, and this was also the case this time, with the court actually rejecting, as it did before, such petitions, saying that it's a political matter, it's for the government to decide. Now, we know that the two far-right ministers, they voted against the deal, but Netanyahu still had a big majority for the plan, because most of the ministers in his cabinet are Likud ministers. But still, he knew that he could take it just as far as that, and including Marwan Barghouti was too much of a risk on the way of approving the deal.
Henry, I mentioned when we listened to Rina on who could be released, I also mentioned you talked about your time in Gaza City, and we all picked up on the fact that you said there's still a fighting force of sorts. I think I'm right in saying you've also kind of zoned in on comments made to you by a senior Israeli military source, talking about how whilst and this is what I guess we have to look at in terms of what remains, whilst in 2023 Gaza City, a lot of the senior commandos were removed, they've been replaced with younger people, and they describe to you, I'm right to say, a system is what they called it. They have a system of combating the Israelis.
Yeah, so we spoke to, we're not actually allowed to identify him, but someone with a very big strategic view, but also a good tactical kind of street-to-street view. And he said that, because of course, the IDF have been into Gaza City, not all of it, but they've been into large parts of it before, once, if not twice. And they've been in December 2023, early 2024. And he said, yeah, look, we killed most of their commanders then in Gaza City, and we killed a huge number of their men. But they've all been replaced. He said the fighters, the new fighters, they're younger. He said they're greener. They don't quite have the same tactical nous as the people they replaced. But he actually said it twice. He said they're very brave. Now look, I think Victor is right. Israel has defeated Hamas to the extent that it's no longer a terror army. It can't operate as an army. It can't move formations of men across the battlefield or do complicated things or react to intelligence. But it's fighting in a guerrilla way. And I think that's what this Israeli official was talking about, fighting as a system, units of 2 or 3 people, responding to, probing for Israeli weaknesses and punishing it. And we saw a 26-year-old IDF soldier was killed by a sniper, I think 2 days ago or maybe yesterday. So I think the point that I took away was that you can defeat an organisation like Hamas, I don't know, substantially, or put a figure on it, 85%, 90%, something like that. But that remainder is incredibly difficult. I mean, you still need to be there in force. You still need to be watching your back, having a huge amount of air power, having a huge amount of reconnaissance and surveillance, and you're still taking casualties. We don't know how much ammunition, how many weapons they still have, how much they stockpiled before they initiated this with the October 7th massacre. We know that they have an unlimited supply of men because there are still hundreds and hundreds of thousands, and it's easy to recruit if you demolish someone's house, for example. So I do think that they have been substantially defeated, but not totally defeated, and that last bit is so significant, and I do think it will play a part in what comes next.
Well, to which comes next, whilst the attempts to get peace and continue peace in Gaza this morning, 11 a.m. in Oslo, in the Grand Hall of the Norwegian Nobel organisation, the chair of the Peace Prize judges announced this year's winner.
It's been a long journey. Mm-hmm. I have to admit, I never thought getting involved into politics. I'm an engineer by training, and I was prepared to be a manager in the steel industry. But when you see your country falling apart and so much suffering, you realize that you have to get involved. And I'm so honored to be part of this huge citizen movement that has already defeated the regime. We defeated them spiritually, socially, culturally, and electorally, politically. What's left is to make them leave power, and that will happen as well soon.
Maria Corina Machado, the Nobel Peace Laureate for 2025, a key Venezuelan opposition leader. She's been in hiding since July the 28th, 2024, the day of the disputed election, when she received threats amid a government crackdown on protesters. She'd already been disqualified from running for election. She was banned for 15 years for alleged support of US government sanctions on Venezuela and running an alleged corruption ring, which she denies a typical regime discrediting tactic, she says. Pro-democracy activist for decades. She turned 53 on Tuesday. She wasn't at the Nobel ceremony today. She spoke on the phone, saying she was completely shocked by the news, delighted. She's long spoken of the fear for her life, constantly being monitored, rarely or of occasion does interviews, including last year to France 24. We heard her talking to the Milken Institute 3 weeks ago. Let me bring in Eric, a worthy winner.
Yes, I would say so. I mean, she's been fighting for a long time for democracy in Venezuela. She's the main opposition leader in Venezuela. So this is a very political choice by the committee. But I think when you see what has happened in Venezuela for the last 10, 15 years, it's gone from a gradually more and more authoritarian regime to a full-blown dictatorship under Maduro. So it's it's a way of supporting what she does and hopefully supporting a peaceful transition.
Very interesting, Rina. Given your time in Bogota, was she a factor? Are you aware of her work then? And just giving your assessment on the challenges she's faced and continues to face.
No, I can't say she was a factor because it was a long time ago that I was in Bogota. But in a way, I think her nomination for the prize, it's a tribute to the women of South America. And we have seen 2 or 3 years ago, in a way, a similar tribute to the women of Iran. Now we see this great tradition of women in these countries fighting for democracy. Another name that comes into mind, we are sitting this evening in Paris, and of course Ingrid Betancourt, also another Latin American, also French, great leader for democracy and for liberty. So the nominee of this year, she's not alone. She's part of this great network, I would say, of women fighting this dictatorship. And we are all hoping, we are all cheering for Venezuela to come out of it. It doesn't seem very optimistic for the moment, but maybe in a way, you know, once the spotlight is on you, it's also a way maybe to assure her security, to open the way for her to come out of hiding, because she's so well known. Who would dare now to attack her? And once she can come out, she can continue her work and maybe lead Venezuela to a better future.
Victor, the White House said it was politics over peace.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to add the name of Maria Ressa to that list of women who fought for democracy and freedom. Maria Ressa of the Philippines, who won a few years ago. Absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, I think what's significant here is that the Nobel Peace Prize Committee is now one of the few sort of major international institutions, organizations that very vocally and openly is standing up for, you know, for democracy, for freedom, and in a way that a lot of governments are now too frightened to do, and a lot of other institutions are too frightened to do. I noticed that the committee said that Maria Corina Machado was keeping the flame of democracy burning amidst a growing darkness. And I think that phrase, growing darkness, is quite significant. What they're saying is that the situation for peace and freedom and democracy is actually getting worse. And it's people like the winner of this year's prize who are actually, helping to try and keep that darkness at bay.
It's interesting, Henry, listening to the result, listening to the commentary on it and the profile of Maria Corina Machado. She's been active for more than 20 years now in hiding. She said all her accounts, all her support network has been cut off. There's very little sort of oxygen to breathe, but she continues in hiding in the same country and having huge influence and in touch with the Trump administration. And she called today for President Trump to continue his help. I wonder, Benjamin Netanyahu has made it clear with a formal letter, we saw that he wanted President Trump to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Will there be disappointment in Tel Aviv?
I sense that the Israelis' engagement with Donald Trump is always quite calculated, and certainly if you're talking about the Hostages Families Forum and things like that, you know, it's calculated to get his attention for a specific end, which is to release the hostages. That seems to be happening. So, I mean, I'm not Israeli, but I imagine that in the hearts of hearts, that's maybe the main thing rather than whether Donald Trump gets the prize. Yeah, I mean, you know, obviously Benjamin Netanyahu said what he said. There was a farmer up in the north of the country who got up early the other morning to plough, you know, Donald Trump for the Nobel Prize or something like that into his field, which was all very spectacular. Look, I hope she ultimately is remembered outside Latin America for the work she does, not being the one who beat Donald Trump to it. I'm not an expert in the Nobel Prize, but I've always thought of it, and certainly with the academic prizes and the literature prize as well, as rewarding kind of long-term hard work as well as great success, and I think that's what she's done. And Donald Trump is not to be dismissed for what appears to be achievement on the first phase of this deal here with getting the hostages out. If it happens, it's a huge achievement, but it's a relatively quick piece of work compared to what she's been doing.
This well, Henry. The farmer continued to plough. It's also a Bruegel masterpiece in the Beaux-Arts Museum in Brussels, to which shows Icarus falling from the sun into the water and everyone, including the farmer, choosing to ignore him. Choose your analogy from that. OK, we'll turn to events here in Paris this week. 20 to 8 on Sunday night, President Macron's chief of staff, Emmanuel Moulin, stood on the steps of the Élysée Palace, reeled off names of the new cabinet chosen by the Prime Minister, Sébastien Lecornu. took him 26 days, not to read the list, but to Lecornu to come up with it. And cut and paste cabinet, it seemed. It was almost identical to the previous list, which hadn't been enough to save Mr Lecornu's two predecessors from the fate of resigning after losing confidence vote while trying to push through an extraordinary budget to make €44 billion of savings to deal with an extraordinary debt. By breakfast, Lecornu had resigned, says he saw no way through the political impasse in place since a hung election last year because of selfish parties unwilling to compromise.
Les partis politiques continuent d'adopter une posture comme s'ils avaient tous la majorité absolue à l'Assemblée nationale. Et au fond, je me suis retrouvé dans une situation dans laquelle j'étais prêt à des compromis, mais chaque parti politique veut que l'autre parti politique adopte l'intégralité de son programme. C'est vrai des formations parfois du socle commun, c'est vrai aussi des oppositions.
Well, he was asked by President Macron to stay 48 hours to try to hold last-ditch negotiations with opposition parties planned for national stability and secure support for the budget. Well, the outgoing Prime Minister tried, failed. However, he said there is, quote, a relative majority are open, he said, to a budget deal. President Macron has a choice, calling snap elections again, even though polls suggest a political lurch to the right, or call presidential elections again, risking a swing to the right, or roll the dice a sixth time in 2 years and announce a new PM. That's what we're expecting him to do any moment. We will bring it to you when it comes. Rina, your thoughts? It is a mystery. Some suggestions it could even be Sébastien Lecornu again.
Anything is possible at this situation. But, you know, when you listen to what he said, of course he's right that every party is entrenched in its own agenda, unwilling to compromise. But I think any French citizen could have told that to Sébastien Lecornu the day he was nominated. I mean, we didn't need to wait the 28 days to come to this realization. There is no news here. And also this effort to maybe arrive to a majority that would approve a budget. That's very well. Let's say we have a new prime minister this evening. Let's say this new prime minister manages by a miracle to get everybody around a budget. Then what? The budget would be approved by the end of December, and we know exactly what will happen on the 1st of January. We will be exactly at the same spot. We will have a budget. That's already a good thing. A budget that won't carry any reform, that's maybe not such a good thing. But the situation, it can't be resolved the way it is, because you have too many blocs that are not willing to sit together. The left is not going to sit together. They are not going to run together the way they did before. The right is completely disintegrated. The far right is unwilling to any compromise. So we're stuck.
We're stuck. Victor, will any face change the dial, or shall I just get out the lettuce and start the timer?
Well, I suppose we might get an announcement in a few minutes, but obviously the way it's going at the moment, or in the last few hours, is that it has to be someone from the left, or so that the Socialist Party doesn't vote down the government in a no confidence vote, or it has to be some kind of neutral technocrat who can allow the left not to vote down the government. Whether that will happen, I don't know. One thing that's certain is that this has got to be the most awful job that anyone is going to take on, even if they can make it last for 2.5 years, which will have to be 2.5 years, won't it? It's not a job that anybody wants, although even the far right, which stands to win, if the National Assembly is dissolved and there's new elections, they stand to win many more seats, but they're still not likely to get a complete majority. But even if they end up with a prime minister, it's not clear that that would actually be something that would really help them in the long run. So nobody really wants, nobody wants Macron to continue, but nobody wants really to be prime minister either. So in a way, it's the end game, I think, in some ways, for the Fifth Republic. The institutions that have sort of worked really well so far in the French system are now just sort of seen not to work. When you have a hung parliament with this kind of division in the country between left and right, and between populist nationalists and liberal internationalists, you just have a problem that seems to be impossible to resolve.
An endgame for the Fifth Republic, possibly an endgame for Macronism. Eric, when you look at this, we know from the Greens and from the Socialists today, on the left, Marine Tondelier and Olivier Faure, kind of saying Mr Macron wasn't listening in the room. It doesn't look like it's going to be a socialist right now. What's your take on, effectively, is it going to be the last roll of the dice for Macron before potentially he resigns?
I think there's a systemic error somehow in the French system now, and I think it depends on exactly the Fifth Republic and the Constitution, how it was designed. I mean, we have now a situation with, well, put it simply, three big blocks, right? The left, the center with Macron as the main politician, and then you have the nationalist right. And these three blocks, they just don't communicate. There's no compromises. But you know, if this would have been a country like mine, like Sweden, the person that names the prime minister would be the speaker of the house. And here it is, in France, of course, it's the president. So the president has named three consecutive prime ministers from this center-right bloc, not his own party only, but this basically Macron loyalists. Mm-hmm. So what you would need in this situation is to probably try one of the other blocks, right? You would try the left or the nationalist right. That's what I think that a speaker would do in a neutral speaker. But since we have this situation with a president that names the prime minister, he continues to name prime ministers from his own bloc, so to say. And this, I'm not saying that would necessarily solve the situation, but at least you would have a little more dynamism in the political game, if you say. That you would have perhaps a left-wing government for a while. It could fall, but they could try to make a deal with the center or parts of the center, or you could have a nationalist right-wing government trying to make deals with, for example, the Republicans. I mean, it's not like it's totally impossible. It's just that now we're stuck in a loop where Macron is giving the prime minister, the post of the prime minister to his own allies, basically. So it's...
And he's in that situation where I saw the Blick headline. We had Richard Worley from Blick here just a few days ago. His headline was Fortress Macron. He's kind of hiding within it. Rina, two things struck out to me this week. One is, I just wonder, for me, one is the fact that Elizabeth Borne, former Prime Minister, suggesting that the pensions that had to be forced through using 49.3 rather than voting them through, she should possibly look at them again. Freeze them, perhaps. She supported them. The second thing, I wonder how fatal this is. Former ally coming out with a kind of et tu, Brute moment, which is Edouard Philippe saying it is time for Macron to go.
And Gabriel Attal also, who said that he does not understand anymore the decision of the president, and who is more loyal to Emmanuel Macron than Gabriel Attal. So two of his loyal people saying that this cannot go on. I think, the reform of the pensions, it's obvious there's not going to be any reform of any kind in the coming budget. It's just impossible even to imagine. Let's just have a budget, some sort of a budget, a compromise budget. We are very far from having that. So having the reform, and of course, I think politically there is no way that they can use again this article to push it in. That's not going to happen. Macron, and I think Eric was very right, Macron has to realize, the only way maybe to break up the deadlock is for cohabitation. You can't have it any other way. With cohabitation, there are no reforms. There are no exceptional measures. It's just a way of surviving until the next presidential elections.
It's rarely done. It's a curse word in France, the equivalent of Macbeth on the stage. You just don't say it. Maybe it has to happen. Thank you. Huge thanks. A brilliant panel this week for clarity, insight only gathered from being on the ground, seeing developments in the long form, understanding in-person stories that can't just be plucked out of an AI data-scraped search, which we'll talk about next Friday, in fact, along with next week's World Event unfold. Until then, we'll leave you with possibly the most unique concert of the week. It is not more Chiba or Sting here in Paris. At the moment, it's to the movie star arena, Buenos Aires, where one-time Mick Jagger impersonator turned Argentinian President Javier Milei combined a book promotion and a rock gig as part of a pre-election relaunch. A sold of 3 for the price of 1. At $5 a ticket, 15,000 supporters gathered to see Milei unplugged. Earplugs optional. We'll see you in 7 days for the world next week.
quiero ver.